All right. We are going to get started here with chapter 32. And as we do so, I want you to please understand that the, uh, the overall crux of what we're doing here is going to be the thing that leads to the Great Depression. And when we're talking here about the Great Depression, we need to understand that this is a huge, pivotal, important time, not just in American history, but in world history. The overall effects of everything that's going to happen are going to be far reaching. They're going to, in some ways, you could very much argue that it's the thing that ends up really leading to World War II. And I'll explain what that looks like here in a little bit as well. And obviously, we know that the long term ramifications economically of the Great Depression. They're far reaching. We're going to end up seeing eventually Roosevelt's New Deal legislation that ends up being something that's pretty pivotal in the forever changing the relationship between government and its people. There's just going to be so much that's going to be far reaching as a result of this. And so this particular chapter gets into, well, it's titled The Politics of Boom and Bust, and it gets into what led us to that point. And you also have to understand that in this particular chapter, if you are a conservative, you're probably not going to love the content. Your textbook and pretty much all social science people and everything like that, they have a tendency to lean left. They lean liberal. And so, therefore, whenever it comes to interpreting what's happened here, there is definitely a left leaning analysis that goes into this. And when you're reading your textbook, you should be picking up on that as well in chapter 32 and 33, because essentially the rhetoric is to one degree or another. It's that conservative economic policies led to the Great Depression. The Great Depression was solved by FDR's nearly socialistic New Deal, and that the biggest critics of FDR were actually liberals who didn't think he went far enough. And so we kind of end up seeing this middle ground idolizing of FDR as a result of all this. So obviously, when we get into the run up of the presidents that we had right before the Great Depression, you're going to see conservative, 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 and they're very similar to one another in approach and things like that. And so this is going to play a role, and I just want you to be kind of braced for that a little bit. We see that in the aftermath of World War One, that there is going to be an election in 1920, and the election of 1920 is going to end up in the successful election of Warren Harding. Warren Harding's running mate, Vice President Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge will also be a very consequential man, because many of you should have remembered this from your previous year, that Warren Harding does not end up serving a full term because he dies in San Francisco. He's an older man, and there were some other things going on that we won't really get into. But he's going to end up dying, natural causes, and Calvin Coolidge will end up being president. So let's get into our first black box here. It says the Republican economic policies under Warren Harding. Okay. What you're essentially looking for here is that he sought to continue the same laissez faire doctrines that had been practiced under William McKinley. Okay. So what we're seeing is a return away from progressivism. There was the laissez-faire, kind of help business along the path toward profits and everything like that. And then we got into progressivism under Teddy Roosevelt, and then Taft, and then Wilson. And then now that Wilson is basically dead at this point, we're going to go to Warren Harding, and he's going to be a return back to the McKinley days. All right. Some of these things that are taking place. During the 1920s, progressivism is just not going to be doing good at all. Okay. Progressivism is not going to be successful because whenever you have so many people that are doing well economically, and I mean, even common people now that we see common people that can afford automobiles and things like that, even common people are doing reasonably well. So therefore, why is anybody going to be concerned about reform? And so you're going to see that in the 1920s, Supreme Court legislation, such as those cases you see listed here on the screen, are going to largely rule against progressive legislation. All right? They're going to rule against progressive legislation. And specifically here, when we start talking about the Supreme Court cases of Mueller and Adkins on the screen here, this is going to be working against the protections that were provided in previous Supreme Court cases for women in the workplace. And they're largely arguing here that if women now have the right to vote, women are equal to men, and we kind of have that movement going on, then essentially women don't need any further protections in the workplace. All right. And so you'll want to make sure you know that one as well. After World War I, we're going to see a return to the isolationism philosophy that was prevalent in America prior to World War I. And the reason for this is basically that we did not want to get involved in World War I to begin with. We kind of got, if you'll remember here, brainwashed into joining the war, fully falling in love with the ideals of Wilson's Charge for War, which is progressivism going to war. But essentially, we're going to see that Europe is not really going to be any better for us having been involved in World War I. So we will return to isolationism, with one exception. One exception to Harding's policy of isolationism involved the Middle East, where the United States sought to have concessions to secure oil drilling concessions for American companies. Okay. So the one time where we're not going to be isolationist is going to be when it comes to oil, because we always want to make sure that we have access to oil. And if you can't already tell my tone, that's not something that's changed a whole heck of a lot. Let's skip some things here just for time purposes. The Washington Conference was held in 1921, 1922. Washington Naval Conference is going to be a collection of world leaders, and this is basically the people that are now in charge of the United States, guys like Harding and Coolidge and some of these guys. They're going to try to do some of the peacekeeping ideals that Wilson had attempted, but we're not obviously going to be joining the League of Nations. And so how do we try to keep the peace without joining the League of Nations? And the Washington Naval Conference is an attempt at that. Essentially, what they're going to do is they're going to agree on a 10-year holiday on naval construction. And what that means is that none of the countries that signed the Washington Naval Conference agreement here, none of them are going to be building new ships and things like that. All right. And many of those nations are going to have to go out and scuttle and scrap some of the ships that they already have. Perfectly good ships. They're going to go out to the middle of the ocean and scuttle those suckers, which means intentionally sink those ships. And among the top three nations, specifically the United States, Britain, and Japan, we're going to reduce them to a level that they were currently at, which was essentially for every 5 American ships, there should be 5 British ships and 3 Japanese ships, which was it was basically the ratio that existed then. The problem we're going to have here is that Japan was actually on the rise. Japan had been very steadily building up their navy and their military prowess, and they were quite proud of that. Japan was a part of the agreement, but the Japanese minister that walked away from the Washington Naval Conference makes a comment and says that this sounds a whole lot like Rolls-Royce Ford. That comes directly out of your textbook as well. We're already starting to see the seeds that Japan is not going to be very satisfied with the way they are treated by other world leaders. In 1928, there's going to be another attempt at keeping the peace through a very pie in the sky, foolish minded agreement called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And the 1928 Kellogg-Briand Pact is going to outlaw war as a solution to international rivalry. Okay. The Kellogg-Briand Pact is going to outlaw war. I mean, we've been as humans fighting against one another basically since the beginning. Why didn't we ever think to make a law against war, right? If you can't already tell my tone, that's called sarcasm. Is the Kellogg-Briand Pact going to be successful in outlawing war? Well, no. Well, because what do you do to somebody that breaks the law? You're going to have to war them, right? So the Kellogg-Briand Pact is kind of foolhardy, but it's right in line with other things that were taking place at the time. Which of these people, and you're going to see this test question on here as well, that were members of Harding's cabinet proved to be incompetent and corrupt? There were scandals during the Harding administration, but please understand, the Harding administration does not last very long. And Warren Harding was a backslapper. He was a good old boy. He's one of those guys that had friends in high places and friends in low places, and essentially ends up surrounding himself by some people who were incompetent and corrupt. One of those ends up being the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, who is involved in what becomes known as the Teapot Dome scandal, and it involved the selling of American property, government property in oil drilling areas. And so he's making money by selling land that was essentially belonging to the United States government. Again, he's incompetent and corrupt. What's going to happen? And if I'm just being honest with you, Warren Harding, he's got a reputation for a number of things. One of those happens to be womanizing. He's actually going to be, he builds tunnels underneath the White House to sneak girls in. And things like that. Supposed to be a happily married man. In reality, he was a womanizer. He is going to go visit Alaska. He's going to come back down. He's going to get sick, not doing very well, finds himself in San Francisco where he has a massive heart attack and dies. And at the time that Warren Harding dies, the whole country goes into mourning because he was a genuinely loved and respected person. It's not until after he's dead and gone that all of the scandals from his administration start to come to light. So whenever he died, everybody is genuinely mourning. But they're soon going to get over that when they start to realize what kind of an incompetent and corrupt individual Warren Harding had been. However, no matter how incompetent and corrupt Warren Harding might have been, Calvin Coolidge is essentially the opposite. Okay, Calvin Coolidge was one of the most honest, frugal, quiet, shy, cautious individuals that you could possibly ever imagine. His nickname was actually Silent Cow. Okay, his nickname was Silent Cow. All of those things very much describe Calvin Coolidge. Coolidge was someone who didn't believe in raising taxes, didn't believe in progressivism and things like that. He believed in hard work. He believed in people who began a business, a career. He believed in entrepreneurship. One of the most famous quotes from Calvin Coolidge, he says, "I refer to myself as the high priest of the great God business." And then goes on to say, the man who builds a factory builds a temple, and the man who works there worships there. He largely was trying to, very much like the days of McKinley, like the days of Harding, try to help business along the path towards profits. He doesn't do that because he's a corrupt man. He's actually extremely honest, and he's a penny pincher man. He doesn't believe in spending money unless it's absolutely necessary. So you're going to see a real tightening of the national budget, and so there's not going to be a bunch of government programs and things like that that are going to be common in progressive days and things of this nature. He's not ranked very highly as a president for that very reason. If I'm being completely honest with you, he's one of my favorites. He's somebody that I can admire and respect and things like that. But he and I think a lot alike in a lot of different ways. Not all ways, but in a lot of different ways. but he was a very quiet, shy kind of guy. I'm going to skip that too. I would like to talk about this question, though. All right. In what ways were the 1920s a reaction against the progressive era? All right. What we are seeing is that progressivism that goes from Teddy Roosevelt to Taft through Wilson, um, they're trying to get in and change the things that's corrupted the heart and soul of America. When you get to looking at our cities and seeing how poor people genuinely are, and we start to see what's happening in politics is a corrupting by money, because there is a handful of people, the extreme top 1%, the extremely wealthy people in this country that have a crazy amount of influence when it comes to government. And so we are going to see that the 1920s end up being very much a reaction against that, because because again, we are borrowing money in order to make money. And we're buying on margin when it comes to the stock market. We have a huge growth in all things economic at this time. The 1920s are essentially they're going to see a growth in a whole lot of industries that before had been unseen. All right, I'm going to move. Is that working? Oh, there we go. Even though everything in the country had been doing well economically when it comes to business, the one area of the country and of the economy that was not doing well was agriculture. And the problem that farmers were facing was not that they couldn't produce enough. The problem was that we had now mechanized the farm. And now that we've mechanized the farm, we are overproducing in ways that we had never had to before. We went from trying to produce as much product on farm as we could during World War One, because we were essentially feeding the whole world, to where we now had way too much stuff, because now European farmers are able to feed their countries. We don't have to feed them, and we now have a gasoline engine tractor that can produce way more than we've ever produced before. And so now we're overproducing at the farm. But as I've told you before, what essentially causes the Great Depression is not that we didn't have stuff. The problem that caused the Depression is that we had too much. We were overproducing at the farm and the factory. And so that continues to be a problem as well. Coolidge is basically going to be president from 1922, 1923. And then by the time we get into the election of 1924, he's now running for his own ticket. He's no longer just the vice president that took over for Harding. He's running on his own ticket. You can kind of see his campaign ad here, and you see keep cool and keep Coolidge. All right. And this was a fairly tight race, but essentially during the economic good times of the 1920s, you're not going to change umpires. And so we are going to very much keep cool, and we will keep Coolidge and keep his policies going for the next 4 years. The Progressive Party did not do well in the 1924 election. Why would that be? For the same essential reason that nothing progressive was working well in the 1920s. Because during economic good times, it's hard to think about the need for reform. The golden wand of prosperity is touching a whole lot of people, even if it is being built on a credit house of cards. So the 1924 election is not going to do well, because we are not interested in reform during those kinds of times. One of the other after effects of World War One. Basically, the Allies that won World War I went through the pockets of Germany while Germany was knocked out, and they're going to demand that Germany has to repay everybody. Germany's at fault for the whole thing, so Germany has to pay these giant amounts of reparations. The reparations that are going to be asked for is going to be something that Germany can't even pay for, because Germany is more broke than they've ever been in their existence. The government at the time, known as the Weimar Republic in Germany, it decided that the only way they could pay their debts was to just print money. Well, if you don't know about the way money works, It just doesn't work like that. You can't print money to solve your problems. If that were the case, why don't we just print more and more and more money, and every one of us in America can just have more and more and more money? Your money has to be built on something, has to be tied to something. And so the idea of printing money to pay your debts is not going to be something that is going to be effective. So what's going to end up happening? Well, the United States had been a country that owed money to people prior to the war. But after the war, because we were essentially the arms dealer that was providing everything, after the war, everybody owes money to us. So, what the French and the British are trying to say is listen, we waited until America the Unready finally entered the fray, and we were the ones holding up a wall of flesh. And so, because we did all of that dying before you guys finally ever entered, we feel like you should go ahead and write off the debt that we owe you as paid in full with flesh. And no matter how you try to make that argument, it's not going to sound very good to the United States, because if people owe us money, we want them to pay us money. It only seems right that way. So, what is essentially going to happen here is that we're going to demand that they pay us back. And what's going to happen is that they are going to demand those reparations from Germany. So, what happens next? Germany is going to have to borrow money in order to pay those reparations back to France and Britain, that's paying that back to the United States. You want to go ahead and take a guess where Germany was borrowing money from? They were borrowing money from American banks. And because they're never going to be able to repay this, they're essentially going to be helping to cause the Great Depression that's going to lead Germany to no longer be held accountable. It's going to give rise to guys like Adolf Hitler, who are going to start marching around and taking over place after place after place, because there's nobody left to hold them accountable whenever the United States depression causes a French depression, causes a British depression, and nobody can afford to make Hitler obey. All right? So this plays out well for everybody, well, for nobody except for Germany. All right? And as as a result of America's insistence that its allied war debts be repaid in full, the French and British demand enormous reparations from Germany, which again causes this cycle of debt that is altogether no good. All right. Again, I'm going to skip some stuff. In 1928, Herbert Hoover. You want to talk about a guy that, by everyone's account, should have been the greatest American president ever. Okay. He had been the guy that fed all of Europe during World War One. He was the guy that was in charge of the food program during World War One. He's also somebody who's seen successful economic times under Harding and Coolidge. Hoover should be the easiest usher in, and he is going to win by the largest electoral vote in United States history. This is in 1928. Again, you kind of know what's coming around the bend. In his convention acceptance speech in 1928, you have one of the most ironic statements to ever be uttered by an American. As Herbert Hoover says, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. We have not yet reached the goal, but given a chance to go forward with the policies of the last 8 years, we shall soon, with the help of God, be inside of the day when poverty will be banished from this nation." Now, why is that ironic? Because the next thing that ends up happening 1 year later is America goes into a stock market crash. That stock market crash is going to have long-term effects that eventually end up in the closing of business after business after business, again, because we're overproducing in these factories, and it will lead to the Great Depression, which will be the greatest rise in poverty in American history. And as he's bragging about eradicating poverty, he ends up in some ways being the cause thereof. He is going to try to do a lot of things to combat this, but essentially all of his policies end up doing the exact opposite of the thing that he thinks that they will, such as the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act of 1930. The Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act is going to raise tariff rates by as much as 60%, which is essentially going to end up being a protectionist war that goes global. We're going to demand that there is high that there's high tariff rates for all the countries that want to ship their goods to us. And so, therefore, anything we want to ship to other countries is going to have a high tariff, which shuts down international trade. And the very people that we could have, offloaded all this excess stuff that we're producing in the factory, those countries are not going to accept American products because we're tariffing the crap out of the things that they're trying to send to us. So this isolationist philosophy when it comes to war is also going to end up being an isolationist policy when it comes to the economy, which is going to plunge us deeper and deeper and deeper into the Great Depression, which is the answer to that question you see right there. Black Tuesday, which is October 29, 1929, is that stock market crash. We saw kind of the early signs of this thing the week before. We thought that we could settle things up on a Friday, let the weekend happen, and then maybe on Monday we open up and things be okay. But on Monday things opened up and it was sell, 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 and nobody's buying. And essentially on Tuesday, October 29, 1929, the stock market itself ends up crashing, which will have disastrous effects, and entire fortunes were lost. Lives are going to be forever changed. Very many people that had huge amounts of money on the stock market are going to lose everything. And this is going to be a very tumultuous time. Please don't get in your mind that the stock market crash caused the Great Depression, because these are two very different things. They are related in some sense, but they are not one thing immediately cause the next thing. We don't immediately go into a depression. It takes time for that to set in. But 1929 is very much a sign of things to come. By the time you get into 1930, 1931, and heading into 1932, we are very much headed toward a depression. We see ironic photos like the one you see here. We see a billboard that says the world's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way. And you got a whole car full of crackers with smiling faces and their little white dog. This is supposed to be the American dream. And the reality is that this is a breadline of Black people trying to get relief that's standing in front of this sign. There could not be a bigger dichotomy between these two concepts, between reality and between that idealistic idea of the American way. What caused the Depression? This comes directly out of your textbook. One basic explanation was overproduction by farm and factory. Please do not forget that phrase. Too much money was going into the hands of a few wealthy people who in turn invested it in factories and other agencies of production, and not enough was going into salaries and wages where revitalizing purchasing power could be more quickly felt. Basically, what happened here is that we should have been paying the individual workers more, so that those individual workers could buy the products that were sitting in factories and in warehouses unbought. But instead of doing that, we were trying to build more factories and more jobs and things like that than really what the market could bear. That's the Depression in a nutshell. We see the rise of everything anti-Hoover at this point, because he's the president during the start of the Great Depression. We see things like Hoover blankets, which is when you see a homeless person trying to cover up with a newspaper, or a Hoover flag, which is when you have an empty pocket with no money in it, or Hoover leather, which is when you have cardboard that's attached to your feet because you can't afford shoes, or a Hoover wagon, which is when you can no longer afford to run your car, so you have a beast of burden that pulls your car down the road. Hoovervilles, which are little shanty towns that are going to pop up on the edges of cities. Essentially, the prosperity of the 1920s is going to come crashing down in a credit house of cards that is going to forever change America. Hoover's attempts at stopping this is he's going to start a big, gigantic government program. All right. This is not a very conservative thing of him to do, but he's going to set up an alphabetical agency of his own called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which is going to distribute direct aid to state and local governments. It'll make loans to banks, railroads, farm mortgage associations, and other businesses. Basically, we're going to pour the money into the people who will in turn funnel that money down to the lower classes so that they can help put them back on their feet. This is basically the opposite approach that FDR is going to take. FDR is going to try to give that money directly to the people at the bottom so that those people at the bottom can buy the things and have a standard of living that can get them through the worst times of the Depression. Neither one of these approaches works very effectively, but we'll talk more about that later. A group of World War I soldiers called the Bonus Expeditionary Force is going to march on Washington, and they're going to demand immediate payment of a bonus that was promised them in 1920. They were supposed to wait till they retired in order to collect that bonus, but essentially what's going to happen here is that they're going to demand that there be an immediate payment of these things. All right. Hoover's handling of the bonus army is going to be the thing that is most disastrous. Instead of him trying to find some middle ground, find some peaceful way to resolve this, he's going to ultimately order in the United States Army to come and disperse these men. A couple of them will die in the process. And when you see the new army that is trying to scatter the old army, nothing could be worse for the image of Mr. Hoover. You'll also see that one of the guys brought in to disperse them, as you see in the picture here, is General Douglas MacArthur, whose famous exploits in World War II will gain him quite the popularity. Ultimately, 1931, Japan is going to go ahead and invade Manchuria. We get here the rape of Nanking. We get all these kinds of terrible, terrible things that are taking place. But as the United States is plunged into a depression, it's going to lead to a global depression. And who's going to stand against Japan when nobody can afford to go to war? So Japan can pretty much essentially do what they want. Again, the thesis being here that there is a sense in which the Great Depression caused World War II. And whenever Japan did that, they went against the Washington Naval Conference. They went against the League of Nations Covenant. They went against the Kellogg-Briand Pact. They went against all of these foolish ways of trying to deal with war. And there was nobody that could do anything to stop Japan here at this point. All right. We will turn this into an Ed puzzle, and you should be experiencing throughout this whole thing the answering of all these questions. So please make sure you've turned that in, and that will essentially be your Chapter 32 work.